You know, as much as I'd like to think that the world is constantly changing and evolving, I personally feel like there's a lot of things that haven't advanced much over the last 30 plus years. Sure, we've made tremendous technological leaps and medicine has advanced to measures that we could have only dreamed possible a few decades ago. But there's one thing that's always remained pretty consistent itself, and that's human nature. That's not to say that we as humans do not try to change the way we think or act. Of course we do. As we grow older, we find new ways to socialize or new people to socialize with, and we often adapt ourselves to seem pleasant to others. After all, we ultimately wanted to be accepted and loved, right? I could be completely off the mark here, but who knows? Another thing that remains vigilant is religion. Obviously, there are the most well-known, commonly practiced religions such as Christianity, Catholicism, Judaism, paganism, so on and so forth. But there are also religions that some of us, myself mainly, have never heard of. Hell, there are new religions being made up consistently, but never really have their flames stoked enough to land en masse or anyone's radar. An unpopular opinion would be that all religions are just cults. And in the prospect of being argumentative, I'd say it's relatively hard to argue against that statement. For context, let's define specifically what a cult is. Merriam-Webster defines a cult as follows. Definition of cult: a religion regarded as unorthodox or spurious. A great devotion to a person, idea, object, movement, or work, such as a film or a book. The object of such devotion. A usually small group of people characterized by such devotion. A system of religious beliefs and ritual. A formal religion. A system for the cure or disease based on dogma set forth by its promulgator. Now that we've established that, let's take a look at the definition for religion. The state of a religious. The service or worship of God or the supernatural. Commitment or devotion to religious faith or observance. A personal set or institutionalized system of religious attitudes, beliefs, and practices. Archaic, scrupulous conformity, conscientiousness. A cause, principle, or system of beliefs held with ardor and faith. When we look at these two definitions, they do seem to be relatively different from one another. But let's take another look at the synonyms for both. Keep in mind that the word cult typically carries a negative connotation, while religion does not, though to some it does. Common synonyms for cult are audience, followership, and following. None of these words sound inherently bad, right? Trust me, I'm not trying to sell you on the idea of a cult. I think blindly following anything without verifiable, refutable proof or any self-conducted research can oftentimes be foolish. Now let's look at the common synonyms for religion. Credo, creed, cult, faith, or persuasion. I would assume during my rambling, most of you conjured this thought that I'm just talking out of my ass and that cults and religions are different based on simply a definition alone. But if that were the case, why would cult be a synonym for religion? Furthermore, why would the word cult itself carry such a negative connotation the world over, but religion not be held to that same standard? Don't worry, I'm not here to get you to join a cult or a religion for that matter. I just wanted to show that, at least in the sense of defining either word, these two things are one and the same. Sure, there are some outlier differences that make one separate from the other, but a large majority of people would not agree with you on that sentiment. Now that I've bored you to death with definition, synonyms, and nonsensical ramblings, I suppose it's time to get into what this video is about. I announced not too long ago that I would work on a video series covering different types of cults, religions, and occult practices. Full disclaimer, I am by no means a professional in religious studies. I have no education in that regard, so everything I say in this video or other videos in this series should be considered subjective-based opinions or ways of thinking. For the first video in this series, I want to talk about the Matamoros sacrifice cult, otherwise known as the NARCOSATANISTS. This was a cult that I had never heard of until recently, which is odd considering how gruesome and heinous the crimes that they had committed were. But bear in mind that this is perceived as a cult. The actions that occurred within when observed stem from religious beliefs and rituals that have existed a lot longer than most would realize. Let's not dawdle any longer, shall we? I present to you the NARCOSATANISTS. this story, there will be two main names, and I'll give a little background on both of these individuals. First, we have Mark Kilroy, age 21, and then we have Adolfo Constanzo, age 26. Let's start with Mark. Mark Kilroy was born on March 5th, 1968 in Chicago, Illinois. Shortly after he was born, his parents relocated to Santa Fe, Texas, where Mark would grow up for more than 15 years of his life with his brother Keith Kilroy. Mark was raised in a Catholic household, and his parents were frequent attendees of Our Lady and Lourdes in the neighboring town of Hitchcock, Texas. Mark was an active teenager and excelled in both academics and athletics, playing basketball, baseball, and even golf. He was also a member of the Boy Scouts and was an honor student at Santa Fe High School, where he had also served as a member of the student council and was a member of the Lambda Chi Alpha fraternity. Eventually, Kilroy would end his run of being an athlete and transfer to the University of Austin, becoming a pre-med student, and was preparing for his medical college admission test. This was the most information that I could find on Mark Kilroy, so let's go ahead and proceed forward. Adolfo Constanzo was born in Miami, Florida in 1962. His father passed during his infancy, so his mother relocated to Puerto Rico with Adolfo, where she would eventually remarry. Adolfo and his family returned to Florida in 1972, where his stepfather would die thereafter, leaving a large inheritance. Adolfo's mother would remarry again, but this time it would be to a man involved in drug trafficking and the occult. This man taught Adolfo philosophies that Constanzo would carry for the rest of his life, that being that non-believers should kill themselves with drugs, and that he could profit from their recklessness and foolishness. Additionally, Adolfo's mother believed that her son possessed psychic abilities. His mother would also introduce him to Palo Mayombe, an African Caribbean religion that involves animal sacrifice as well as being introduced to Santeria. Adolfo would start as a palero, which is someone who practices Palo Mayombe, and eventually work himself into the padrino role, or basically a high priest. He would eventually move to Mexico City in 1984 to start his career in life as a tarot card reader and inevitably developed a following. He was known for being attractive and charismatic, previously working as a male model, and his claimed psychic talent granted him opportunities to interact with the upper class in Mexico City. He built a reputation for predicting the future, as well as offering ritual cleansing, which had become popular with drug dealers, musicians, and law enforcement. Alongside Constanzo, and a name that was not mentioned previously, was Sarah Aldretti. Sarah was an honors student and a cheerleader at Texas Southmost College. Friends and family recall Sarah being friendly and did not show any signs of abnormal behavior or involvements with any kind of religions. Across the border in Matamoros, however, Sarah was involved in drug smuggling operations and cult activities. Former classmates would later note that it was suspicious that she drove a 1989 car with a telephone embedded and that she dressed in all black. Listen, can we stop referring to dressing in all black being suspicious? That's not always true. Sarah was also the girlfriend of Gilberto Sosa, a drug dealer linked to the Hernandez clan, from whom Constanzo wanted to meet. Adolfo and Sarah met in 1987, and this is where the NARCOSATANISTS would start to take shape. I'm sure at this rate that you're curious and wondering, okay, but where does Mark Kilroy play into all of this? If you haven't figured it out yet, don't worry. We'll get there. So, Adolfo and Sarah meet. It's believed that Sarah used her attractiveness and charm to help him lure men into joining their following, or to set them up to be abducted and killed. Individuals were recruited by showing them the film The Believers, which was a film about a New York City-based cult that practiced human sacrifice for money, power, and influence. Individuals would be indoctrinated by being made to watch the film over and over and over again to express the importance of human sacrifice. Now that we've established some background, let's return to Mark Kilroy. On March 10th, 1989, Mark was picked up by a group of friends to head to South Padre Island, Texas for spring break. After a 9-hour drive, they arrived just before midnight. Kilroy and friends checked into the Sheraton Hotel the next morning before they headed out to the beach. At the time, they had arrived well ahead of the horde of spring break visitors. Into the weekend, students from all over the country poured onto the island, with beer companies staging numerous entertainment events such as movies, concerts, surfing simulation activities, and chances to appear on television or even possibly in commercials. After a night of partying, Kilroy and friends laid out a plan for their daily routine. After enjoying festivities and partying throughout the day, the company would make their way back to their hotel to plan their trip into Mexico. Kilroy and his friends departed that evening, stopping at a Sonic drive-in in Port Isabel for dinner, where they met a group of girls from the University of Kansas who had also planned a trip into Mexico. Kilroy, his friends, and the girls all crossed the U.S.-Mexico border near the Gateway International Bridge. The majority of the evening was spent at Sgt. Pepper's nightclub in Matamoros before going on their own journeys. Kilroy and company returned to the South Padre Island the next morning. The next day, Kilroy and friends attended another event behind the Sheraton before meeting with fraternity friends at a condo party. That night, Mark and his buddies returned to Matamoros, parking once again near the bridge and crossing the border on foot. That night in Matamoros had seen more than 15,000 tourists from the United States on the main street of Alvaro Obregon. Mark and his friends decided to find the first location they could with the shortest line to get in, which landed them at Los Sombreros. After a few drinks, Mark and his friends would depart from Los Sombreros to the London pub, which had rebranded itself as the Hard Rock Cafe for spring break. While there, during a chaotic bout of tourists throwing beer from the balcony, Kilroy would disappear and not be seen again by his friends for an extended period of time. It was noted that later that night he was spotted leaning against a car talking with a woman from the Miss Tanline contest earlier that night. Unfortunately, the group became divided with two of Kilroy's friends landing at Garcia's. Kilroy stopped at the steps of a house to say goodnight to the woman from the Miss Tanline contest. Afterwards, he waited for his friend Huddleston, who had taken off to urinate in an alleyway. When Huddleston returned, Mark Kilroy had vanished. Kilroy's friends searched for him for hours, even going to bars and nightclubs that had already closed, roughly until 4:30 in the morning. Inevitably, they crossed back over the border thinking that he had returned to Brownsville and had been waiting at the car for them. They spent a little more time waiting, as they soon discovered that he was not at the car, before returning to South Padre Island, assuming that maybe he had left with someone else for the night. The next morning, when they woke, Kilroy was still missing. His friends filed a missing person report. Going back to the night that Kilroy went missing, while Huddleston was out of sight and unable to hear, Kilroy stood waiting in the street. He was lured by a man parked inside a red truck who allegedly called out to Kilroy asking if he needed a ride. Once Mark had neared the truck, he was grabbed by two men named Serafin Garcia and Malio Torres, who wrestled Mark into the truck. Thanks to Kilroy's size and athleticism, he was able to break free for about 2 blocks, while one of the assailants stopped to catch their breath. Mark ran from the red truck, but was intercepted by another vehicle and was taken at gunpoint. Once he had been caught, he was subdued and taken in cuffs into another vehicle. They soon departed through the back streets of the city and past the industrial part of town. Soon they drove down a dirt road that led past 2 cornfields, arriving at a private ranch known as Santa Elena. Kilroy was left in the car overnight. At sunrise, he was fed bread, eggs, and water. Roughly 12 hours after his abduction, Adolfo Constanzo and his crew would come to see Kilroy, wrapped his face and mouth with tape before walking him through a field to a storage cabin with his hands bound behind him. Kilroy would be tortured and sodomized repeatedly throughout the night before being led to a field where Constanzo would kill him by chopping the back of Mark's head and neck repeatedly with a machete. His brain would be boiled in a gunga, forgive my butchering of that word. It's a type of metal pot or a cauldron used to cook or stew human and animal remains. Mark's legs would be severed above his knees for burial. A metal wire would be run through his spinal cord to remove the bones after his remains decomposed. He was later buried on the grounds of the ranch. The investigation into Mark Kilroy's disappearance started out like a normal missing persons report. After all, it wasn't uncommon for students to go missing in Matamoros only to turn up the next day with a hangover and memory loss due to the excessive drinking and partying. However, Mark's case would become, let's say, a little bit more high profile when it was discovered that Mark's Uncle Ken worked for the U.S. Customs Service in Los Angeles. Originally, the task force that formed to locate Mark formed in Brownsville. Police had shifted blame and fabricated that Mark had disappeared in Brownsville out of fear of bad publicity and a decline in interest in tourism to South Padre Island. However, Mark's friends would not stand for these remarks to be made and denied that Mark had vanished in Brownsville. The Mexico Federal Police offered to assist U.S. investigators in the search and worked together to question witnesses and informants to uncover any shred of evidence into Mark's disappearance. On April 1st of 1989, Mexico state authorities stationed at a routine checkpoint near Santa Elena Ranch noticed a vehicle had run through a checkpoint without stopping. The vehicle had crossed the international border from Texas and rushed through Mexican Federal Highway number 2 that connects Matamoros to Reynosa, Tamaulipas. After following the vehicle via silent pursuit, the driver was discovered to be none other than Serafin Garcia, the man who had kidnapped Mark weeks prior. After tracking Sedefin for a distance, they were led to the ranch. Time passed during their observation, and Sedefin departed the ranch again. During this time, law enforcement took it upon themselves to search the grounds. During their search, they uncovered cult paraphernalia. But instead of arresting Sedefin immediately, they instead took time to gather more information on the criminal activities that took place at the ranch and the crime members connected to the Hernandez family. On April 9th of 1989, state authorities returned with numerous other officers and arrested Sedefin, his uncle Elio, as well as cult members David Valdez, Sergio Salinas, and Domingo Bustamante, who was the caretaker of the ranch. The detainees remained calm as they were sent to prison while the caretaker was interrogated. Domingo would unveil that the ranch had numerous visits from Sedefin's group, in addition to identifying Kilroy via photograph, noting that he had seen him near the shack that he had been taken into. In Sedefin's questioning, he confessed to participating in Kilroy's murder as well as additional murders. Furthermore, Sedefin would identify Constanzo and Aldrete as heads of the cultist group, adding that Constanzo ordered the killings in part of a sacrificial ritual. Adolfo believed that sacrificing humans guaranteed his members strength, abundance, and immunity from law and personal injury. Sedefin would elaborate that Mark Kilroy was chosen at random, since the order from Adolfo was to find a white Anglo male. Sedefin would further illustrate that Kilroy was killed by Constanzo with a machete and that the body was buried at the ranch. He took police to the exact spot where Mark was buried that had been marked by a wire sticking out from the ground. He mentioned that the wire was attached to Kilroy's spinal cord so that they could pull the bones out to wear as necklaces after the body had decomposed. On April 11, 1989, Sedefin and 4 others were taken to Santa Elena, where the body as well as many other remains would be revealed. The suspects would be forced at gunpoint to spend several hours digging up the graves they had made. Officers would note that Kilroy's remains were missing the legs, of which Sedefin would exclaim that this was simply for burial purposes, not for ritual purposes. During the excavation process, 15 mutilated bodies would be uncovered in addition to Kilroy, all of which would be men who had been killed over the span of the course of 9 months. Brownsville police would identify Kilroy's remains as a positive match, with dental records matching teeth found at the scene of the crime. The remaining victims were determined to be rival drug dealers of Constanzo's and not random sacrificial victims of the cult. Only 3 of the 15 bodies were not identified. In the midst of all this, copious amounts of drugs were seized, in addition to 12 firearms, including 3 submachine guns and 11 separate vehicles. An iron pot had been located in which investigators would discover a human brain, the head of a goat, chicken feet, a turtle, many herbs, a horseshoe, and coins, all mixed with animal blood. On April 13th, what was intended to be a religious ceremony to celebrate Mark's safe return was instead converted into a memorial service held at Our Ladies of Lourdes Catholic Church in Santa Fe. A few weeks after the bodies had been exhumed, law enforcement officers returned to Santa Elena with a curandero to purify the shack where Kilroy was housed, as well as the home itself, chanted a few prayers, and sprinkled the floor with salt, and then finished their ritual with making the sign of a cross. Officers then doused the shack with gasoline and burned it to the ground, leaving a cross remaining in the ashes. While no official word had been offered by government officials, it was surmised that the police officers' motives were supernatural in nature, only offering that they knew this shack would mean a lot to Constanzo and would prompt him to go insane. On the day that the bodies would be exhumed, Adolfo would flee Mexico with Aldrete, Martin Rodriguez, and additional members of his cult, prompting an international manhunt. Meanwhile, in Matamoros, Aldrete's home would be raided, where they would discover an altar and religious imagery. Officers also noted that the house's interior was covered in blood. On April 17th, one of Constanzo's homes would be raided, where they would discover what was described as piles of pornography and a hidden ritual chamber with an altar. Numerous arrests took place following these discoveries to attempt to catch or gain knowledge of the whereabouts of Constanzo. During the investigation, officers noticed that the Matamoros killings were similar to murders that had been carried out in Mexico City from 1987 to 1989. After consulting with craft practitioners and sorcerers, police discovered that Constanzo may be hiding out in one of Mexico City's boroughs. Once law enforcement officers managed to narrow down a location, they continued to investigate and search for Adolfo. A specific man was spotted at a local grocery store attempting to buy large amounts of groceries using US dollars. This man would be followed and unveiled to be De Leon, one of Constanzo's cult members. On May 18, 1989, officers surrounded an apartment complex in Rio Seña in an attempt to raid and recover Constanzo. A black vehicle pulled up in front of the complex, and during a distracted investigation, Adolfo peered out his window to discover officers practically at his door. He then opened fire on officers and proceeded to throw gold coins and cash out of the window, burning some of his money in a stove. Running out of ammunition and patience after about a 45-minute standoff, Constanzo ordered De Leon to kill both him and Quintana Rodriguez. De Leon would struggle with the idea before being struck by Constanzo, who instructed, "If you do not do this, you will burn in hell." De Leon then gunned down 2 men in a closet before police breached the door of the apartment. The remaining living members of the cult were taken into custody. De Leon admitted to participating in Kilroy's murder, but all members agreed that Constanzo conducted most of the murders himself. Aldrete denied any participation in the murders, stating that she was unaware of any activities until the victims had been revealed on television. Sarah Aldrete would go on to proclaim her innocence, speaking in the 2000s, stating that she would not ask for forgiveness for the crimes because she believed in God and never participated in the acts. She also claimed that she was tortured into confession. In an autobiography, she would say that she was taken hostage by Constanzo after meeting him in Mexico City. She further claimed that he would not let her go because he assumed she would go to the police if she had been set free. Additionally, she would say that Constanzo and the rest of the group were made aware of the killings that occurred in Matamoros until they knew that the police were looking for them and decided to go into hiding out of fear for their lives. Aldrete would also say that the events that led to Adolfo's death were significantly different and that he was executed on site by police officers, and questioned why law enforcement would burn down the shack that could have had crucial evidence in their investigation, such as fingerprints that could lead to the real murderers. In the aftermath that occurred after Kilroy's murder, the media would spin the drug group as Satanists. The United States media would continue this trend for some time, leaving no mention of the drug-related violence or crimes, which led to less being known about what happened in Matamoros. Most common reports would be that human body parts were found in a large metal pot and that a group practiced cannibalism. When the rumors of Satanism died down, scholars of Palo Mayombe would cite that Adolfo Constanzo was fueled by psychopathy and personal convictions involved in the spiritual practice. They argued that Constanzo used Palo Mayombe for his own financial and psychological needs by convincing his cult members to help further his drug trafficking operations. Via human sacrifice, Constanzo offered protection from the law. Other scholars maintained that Constanzo murdered Kilroy because he truly believed it was required and that Constanzo believed in Cadium Pimbe. Ultimately, any knowledge as to the true meaning of why Adolfo Constanzo committed the crimes that he did will remain a mystery, as he's no longer alive to tell the story of the narco-Satanists. Yes, I did change shirts. Thank you for asking. Something that I've kind of been forgetting to do with my most recent uploads, and I'd like to do now, is thank 2 of my Patreons, Windrunner and Laura Shrimplin. I do apologize in the delay, but moving forward, I will make a solid effort to try to include you guys in the credits as promised per Patreon. Let me know what you guys thought about this video. I intend to make more videos surrounding cults, religions, the occult, and things of that nature. I think a lot of people will probably find it interesting, as I personally find it interesting, and I think it's a nice transition away from some of the earlier content that I made, while still somehow maintaining roughly close to the same subject, in a manner of speaking. Leave me a comment down below. As always, your feedback is appreciated. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and give it a thumbs down if you're a salty bitch. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.